Militaries across Latin America are taking on greater roles and wielding more power. We will take a look at what that means for democracy in the region. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It can be seen as ironic, but Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro just named a military general to be the Minister of the Civil House, a role similar to Chief of Staff. It is the latest example of a trend in Latin America, the militarization of civilian governments. During the 1960s and 70s, many countries in the region were under military rule that, in many cases, resorted to violence to control the population. Fast forward to recent years, and we're seeing a growing military presence in the governments of Latin America. For more, we turn now to CGTN's Paulo Cabral in Sao Paulo. And Paulo, Brazil's president is a former army captain, the vice president is a retired general, and now the new chief of staff is also a general.
Well, that's right, Anand, and as you said, President Bolsonaro himself, a former military, has surrounded himself in the government with other military, as you just said, the new chief of staff, Braga Neto. You know, ironically, the chief of staff in Brazil is called the head of the civilian house, of the Casa Civil, and since military rule, we never had really a military as the head of the Casa Civil here in Brazil. And not only him, actually, the four ministries that have offices inside the presidential palace are now occupied by military. There is the Institutional Security Ministry, the General Secretary of the government, and also the government secretaries are all high-ranking officials that are inside the presidential palace now with President Bolsonaro. And of course, we also have Vice President Hamilton Mourão, who is actually seen as somebody very pragmatic and moderate in the government of Bolsonaro that sometimes ends up in strong controversies with the media. And Mourão was always seen as a more pragmatic voice. He was a bit more distant of Bolsonaro in the last few months, and now we see these two getting closer. So another demonstration of this influence of the military in the government. And also interesting to say, often it's said that the Brazilian government is divided in two wings, the more ideological right wing, that's the ideological wing, and the other side is the military wing that's seen as more pragmatic. So they are kind of well accepted by Brazil's establishment now.
And Paulo, what about other countries in the region?
Well, we do see that actually in 2019, when the countries in Latin America, several of them had to deal with protests in the streets. We did see President Piñera in Chile, President Moreno in Ecuador, and also President Vizcarra in Peru really using the military or being shown with the military very often. The military also important in the efforts of the government to reestablish order, to police streets. So it must be said also that there is in Latin America a kind of resistance with the presence of the military in politics because of the history of the continent, with many military rules, dictatorships in the 1970s and 80s particularly. So this is seen with some reservation by the people usually here in Latin America. But so far it's also important to say that the military have not given any signs that they would be interested in actually returning to power by any kinds of coup d'etat, as it has happened in Latin America very often in the 1970s. But yes, they are more and more occupying spaces, this case called upon by civilian presidents, or in the case of Brazil, by the former military Jair Bolsonaro.
Thanks, Paulo. That's CGTN's Paulo Cabral reporting from Sao Paulo. Well, there is a lot to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Here in our studio, Eric Farnsworth is the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. Also with us, Tiago de Aragao is the Director of Strategy for ARCO Advice. Joining us from Buenos Aires, Karina Solmirano is an international security expert and a professor at the Universidad de San Andreas. And Lucas Kerner is a political analyst and editor for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. He joins us from Santiago. Welcome to all of you. Karina, let me start with you. We just heard from our reporter there how the military is getting into many positions of power across Latin America. In fact, the magazine America's Quarterly says that Latin America risks becoming the land of militarized democracies. And given the rather sordid history of military rule in Latin America in the past, why is this happening again?
It's a really good question. I think that we thought that with democracy, the military went back to the barracks, right? And it's been 30 years since the whole region in Latin America is democratic. And however, over the past 10 years or so, we have seen a growing influence of the military, whether it's in politics, whether it's in some businesses, influencing certain police forces, for instance, in Central America. I really don't think there is only one reason to explain this pattern of growing militarism in Latin America. I think it's a combination of the political and economic situation. Maybe some of the people who actually call as well for the militaries to step in, especially when it comes to security. We have seen in some polls that people trust more in the armed forces in Latin America than in the police or in the justice institutions. And so this is partially one of the reasons that perhaps they regain some sort of power or they retain part of the autonomy that they used to enjoy during the 70s and the 80s.
Okay, Eric, there's a big question mark if we look at some of these countries in Latin America over the kind of faith that people have in civilian institutions, if I could put it that way. You know, when Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro was elected, people took to the streets to cheer the military. And we have some numbers, actually. A poll in Brazil, I think we're going to put that up. A poll in Brazil last July showed 42% of the population trust the armed forces, and just a scant 7% have nice things to say about Congress.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we see the pattern replicated throughout Latin America in some way. But the military does have a credibility that many of the elected leaders don't have. And the reason why is because the elected leaders have not been able to deliver on the expectations that many of their people have in terms of economic growth, in terms of quality of life, in terms of security and safety in the streets. I mean, if you look at the top the top cities in the world where crime is an issue, many of them are actually located in Latin America. And finally, people have said enough. We're tired of crime. We're tired of not being able to get our kids safely to school and back, you know, go about our daily lives and things like that. And if the police forces, for example, are perceived as corrupt, and many of them are, what security establishment exists to maintain order in the country? And so you see a lot of people saying, you know, we are looking for safer streets, we're looking for anti-corruption, and so we want to have a bit of support from the military, not to say that they want the military to come to power, that's not the point. But if the civilian leadership can't do it, then you're starting to see some people talk about those issues. So this is more of a failure of leadership than any sort of desire of the militaries to actually come in and take power.
But I'm wondering if the military has actually got into power, Eric, but under the guise of being civilian leaders.
Well, I mean, I think that's a question mark that has to be asked. No, and each country's different.
Right.
And there's some countries like Venezuela where the military is clearly in power and they're clearly taking over the country and it's become quite a human rights disaster. But across most of Latin America, this is a different sort of scenario and it's evolving. It's something to be aware of, that's for sure.
Okay, that's a question I want to put to Lucas. I'll get to him in a moment, but Tiago, I want to first get to you and continue to look at the situation in Brazil. I mean, how does one explain the popularity of the military there? And the fact that people have so little faith in the civilian structures?
Well, first of all, the Brazilian Congress has been in evidence a lot in Brazil since 1985. So the presence of Brazilian politicians in television, getting things right, getting things wrong, is continuous. When we advance further, we had the car wash operation a few years ago that struck hard in the heart of the Brazilian Congress.
There was a big corruption investigation.
Huge corruption investigation that got several Brazilian politicians that were in Congress, they were caught. And more than that, there is a lack of knowledge of the real role of the Congress, of the procedures of the Congress, and how the Congress can determine the life of an individual. In democracies where the level of education is low, the dependence on a single individual rises. So there's a lot of confidence in the president, as long as he starts to deliver, and very little confidence in the Congress as an institution. The military has always been more quiet, without showing off a lot, and different than in Argentina, for example, there was a clear attempt of rehabilitation of image of the Brazilian military since 1985.
Right.
Getting involved into several humanitarian actions in the Amazon forest, operating in several campaigns throughout the country that grew the confidence and the sympathy of the Brazilian people towards them.
Lucas Kuna, you do a lot of work on Brazil. You run the website Venezuela Analysis. Eric just told us a moment ago that the military in Venezuela play a big role in the day-to-day affairs of running that country. You agree?
Yeah, I think that as you've seen over recent years after the death of Hugo Chavez and the collapse of oil prices and the deepening crisis there, President Maduro has been obliged to cede more and more power to the military to avert the kinds of coups that you've seen in other countries in the region, like in Honduras in 2009 and most recently in Bolivia. That there's always a risk in Latin America, especially with the presence of the United States, that in order to maintain a civilian government in power, you need to please the military. And certainly Maduro has done that through granting numerous concessions in the areas of oil and gas, as well as mining, as well as a number of cabinet positions. And this is, so it's very important. But Venezuela is by no means exceptional in this regard. I think you can look at Colombia, where you have also seen an extremely outsized role of the military in the civil war there, and which has increasingly been targeting internal enemies in a way that has also produced very massive human rights consequences. So I think that it's not limited to a Venezuela-only phenomenon, but certainly Venezuela's military has played an increasingly more important role in recent years.
Would it be fair to say, Lucas, that without the help of the military, without the support of the military, President Maduro would not be president?
I would say that yes, the military, the refusal of the military to side with the United States and side with Juan Guaido and remove Nicolas Maduro last year and to the president is one of the key factors that keeps him in power. But we can't dismiss the role of grassroots support, that he still continues to have a base around a quarter to 30% of the population that mobilizes massively in support of him, even though a much larger section of the population is either in support of the opposition or supports neither side. So that definitely, there are both factors that are at play.
Karina, Lucas just mentioned Bolivia. We had those disputed elections in Bolivia. That was big news around the world. The military came out and called on President Evo Morales to step down to diffuse tensions in the country. Did the military overstep their duties at that point?
I think so. I think it did. Although we can discuss whether Evo Morales was rightfully in his right to look for another term, or we can question the elections and the way the elections had been conducted. The truth is that the military stepping in and telling the president to leave power, for me, it was very dangerous. It indicates that the military still has a lot of that influence that I was talking about earlier, that they believe that they are the guardians of the republic or the guardians of the nation. And this goes against some of the most important principles of a democratic regime, which is that the military is subordinated always to the civilian authorities. And this is clearly not the situation that happened in Bolivia with the military asking Evo Morales to resign.
Eric, we look around Latin America, and I'm wondering how much of this has to also do with optics and the way politicians frame their roles in those countries. We have these protests in Chile. Protests are still going on. At the height of the protest, President Sebastián Pinero declared a state of emergency. But standing on either side of him were military people.
Yeah.
We had the same thing in Ecuador as well, when President Lenin Moreno addressed his countrymen, there were military standing around him.
I think, Anand, you're quite right.
Yeah.
I think optics is really the key word here. And when you get uniformed officials standing behind presidents in almost any country in Latin America, that does call to mind some of the history of the region, the 60s and 70s that we've been talking about. So the optics there are immediately off-putting. Having said that, it does seem as if some of those military officials were brought in by the leaders themselves to show that the leaders remain in control of their own governments, of their own streets, and that they're looking to try to find ways out of these protests that you've referred to. It does not, in my view, indicate a desire or even necessarily a willingness of some of these militaries to actually step in and take power. But we do have to be very careful about what the signal is being sent and who is sending that signal. So I think you're quite right.
You want to say something? Yeah. In Brazil, Tiago, what kind of role is the military playing right now?
Well, when President Bolsonaro was elected, he had been before a congressman for almost 30 years.
Right.
And he had been a congressman that was never part of any political group. He was not known for the capability of bringing group together or being a leader within a specific topic. At the same time, we had an environment in Brazil that repudiated any sort of politician at the time. So it made sense for him to seek for individuals that had a clear and transparent perception from the eyes of the society to fill in roles that he had never constructed historically as a congressman to occupy those places. So it's natural, if you exclude all the military within the government, it's very hard to identify experienced individuals that he would be willing to put in those positions. There are a lot of positions to fill. So naturally, he looked at the military based on the narrative of his history, of the desire of the people for security as the number one issue to be dealt with, as well as transparency and ethical behavior, and tried to occupy these places with the closest individuals that he could know to put this. So the participation of the military, it's something that makes sense within his mindset.
So people don't look at this ideologically. They look at it as, we have a problem, whether it be security or crime or whatever the case may be. That's the person who's going to solve it for us. We want that guy.
Exactly. The ideological view, to many people, it's impossible not to be there.
Right.
Perhaps the ideological view was not the initial point to justify or that triggered the presence of the military. Maybe it's the other way around. The presence of the military justified an ideological position. But I think it's very far to say that the presence of the military in government could directly be linked to a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
I see, for example, the interpretation of the roles of the press as a bigger threat for democracy in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and others in the region than a military participation within the administration.
Okay. Karina, what do you make of the points that Tiago has just made, that the growing role of the military in these countries don't really pose a threat to democracy in those countries? There are other institutions, like the media he mentioned, that might even pose a bigger threat.
I didn't get quite your question. If you can repeat it, please. I was just listening to the colleague, but I didn't get your question, please.
Yeah, no, the points that Tiago was making is that the growing role of militaries in Latin America don't necessarily pose a threat to democracy in those countries. I mean, the threats may come from other places, like the media. Have I got that right? Yeah.
Or like the interpretation of the government of how the press and the media should behave.
Right. Okay.
Interference on media.
Okay. Did you get that, Karina?
Yes, I got it. I don't know. I might disagree a little bit. I don't think. I do agree that maybe the military is not the threat to the democratic regimes, especially in South America. But I don't think the media necessarily. We do have, and I want to acknowledge that it's a reality, that we do have sometimes very, very big differences when it comes to the way that some of the media informs the politics or the economy or the different daily facts in Argentina and maybe in Brazil. But I would disagree that they pose a threat. I think that if there is any threat to the democratic regimes in our region, I don't necessarily would look at it and at one single actor. I think it's a combination of things. For instance, you might look at the way that Chile reacted to just one single thing that was just raising the metro in Santiago, and something that it was only like 40 cents or something that maybe you would say, well, this is not significant, but it was actually carrying the grievances of the middle classes of Chile that for a long time felt excluded from the model. And so I think if you look at that situation, you see that there is a structural and maybe an even larger picture that is basically affecting Chile, to the point that the president had to say, okay, this is the reform of the constitution that I suggest, because this is the demands of the people. But I don't necessarily think it's a one single factor explanation. I think we need to look at the whole picture. And maybe I missed some of the examples of how the media might be a threat to democracy, but in my personal opinion, I don't think that they are.
Yeah.
Can I make?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think she misunderstood what I said. I never said that the media is a threat to
It's
democracy.
how it's seen, yeah.
It's the opposite. It's the interference of governments on media. Is the interference of governments on how the press should behave. Is the direct criticisms to how the press behaves, that this is a threat to democracy. The press should be free, the press should be open, and in no way I mentioned that the media is a threat, but the unfair behavior that many times, many governments in the region, they treat the media too.
Right. Eric, we had several years in Latin America where we didn't have this kind of problem. We didn't have, the military playing such a large role. It kind of coincided with the commodities boom.
Yeah.
But that's not there anymore. Is there a connection?
I don't think there's a direct connection, but probably indirect. I mean, the thing that commodities boom is, we've talked about this several times, is it really raised the expectations. It allowed governments to have resources that they didn't previously have, to invest in their own economies, to distribute wealth more broadly around the region, et cetera. But at some point, the commodities boom, by definition, ended. And so then you didn't have those resources available, but you still had the expectations of your citizens, which now are even more complicated, because the higher up the income level you go, the higher your expectations become on healthcare, education, infrastructure, all of these things. And so if those aren't occurring, then the people begin to get a little bit frustrated. And so I think this is what we're seeing. So in the electoral side, we're seeing candidates who have been elected who may be non-traditional candidates. We've seen that in Brazil, we've seen it in Mexico, we've seen it in other countries around the region, and more willing to take a chance on non-traditional sort of leadership.
Right.
Now, how does that play into the military side of things? Well, I think that the military is not unobservant of all these things that are happening too. And again, I don't think that the militaries in any particular country necessarily want to re-enter politics. This is not the 1970s, then the military institutions themselves have broadly been reformed, but they're also affected by inefficient governments. Right. They're also affected by criminal activity. They're also affected by all the things that the broader population is. And so to the extent that they're not being served by their civilian leaders, I think they certainly are frustrated as well. Yeah. This is a complicated issue. And, I think the one thing that they have to resist, or they need to resist, is being used by the elected leadership as props, right? And I think this is something that we've sort of alluded to already in this conversation.
Yeah. Lucas, there is one other risk I want to talk about. When we see the growing influence of militaries in Latin America. Last week, the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, he accused his Brazilian counterpart, Jair Bolsonaro, of being behind, quote, terrorists and violent threats against Venezuela. When you hear that kind of rhetoric, I mean, and if the military has a big role and a big say in how the government is run, is there a risk that this militarization in governments could lead to conflict?
I think that we have to take the context that Venezuela is currently in the crosshairs of the United States. The United States has continually threatened military intervention against Venezuela, and that Colombia and Brazil have likewise allied themselves with the Trump administration and have maintained a very belligerent posture. And for this reason, there's a very dangerous situation that we are seeing along the borders, in which you see Brazil and Colombia last year allowing their borders to be used to forcibly enter quote-unquote humanitarian aid, which the Red Cross had condemned as basically a provocation, a politicized effort. So I think that it's a very dangerous situation when you have the United States, which is the biggest military power in the world and is arguably the biggest aggressor in the world because it is currently engaged in 7 wars and is training most of the militaries of this region and who are currently engaged in very questionable human rights practices, whether it's in Chile with the deployment of military in the streets here, or it's in Colombia with the war there and the false positive scandal, the numerous scandals in which many thousands of innocent civilians have been killed. So I think that we need to have a real re-examination of the role of the United States in training regional militaries, which continues to have a very devastating impact for human rights. And we need to have a conversation about how we can de-escalate the situation between Venezuela and other countries, and that enters the conversation of sanctions and other issues of migration, et cetera.
Yeah. Tiago, one other point. To what extent is our military seen as a kind of barrier or a protective force, a bulwark, if you like, against growing levels of violence which are coming from gang violence, drug trafficking? We see the growth of militaries in Central America, for instance. 3 countries here I had, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Their militaries have grown 20% since the Cold War lows. Mexico has created a 60,000 force National Guard exactly a year ago, in February last year.
Well, the situation in Brazil is very different from those countries.
Yeah, yeah.
First, we have state military polices. There are reminiscences of when these states, they had bigger authority within the Brazilian Empire.
Yeah.
So the budget to sustain those military forces, those state military forces, comes from the state. So from the local province, from the state. So you have cases in which some are corrupt, some are not, some are well paid, some are not. The participation of the Brazilian armed forces can only occur if a governor formally requests for the president. So right now, they don't represent much, or they don't represent anything at all in terms of containing the violence in Brazil, unless a specific governor calls for them. However, some new governors, they have a more modern approach to dealing with their local polices,
right,
and they have been able to contain violence locally. But it's something that varies a lot from province to province.
Yeah. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello, everybody. I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week, we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists, and others. It's a fresh, focused, and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict, or US politics, the Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.